Thank you, Presiding Officer, and let me congratulate the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee for the substantial work they've done in producing this report. The very fact we now have a committee that has post-legislative in its title is, I think, a very welcome move forward, because historically we've mumped and moaned on the back benches, the front benches, and quite generally about a lack of scrutiny of legislation. Today sets a pretty high benchmark for what we now might see in future. One of the things I would say is I'm reminded by this whole process how things change and how they don't, because this in post-legislative scrutiny stands in a very important place. Firstly, all but the member in charge of the bill at stage 3 have departed this Parliament. So there's only one left. Well done, Christine Graham. She truly is the last person standing. I congratulate her. Now, of course, when the bill came forward, it was well-intentioned and widely supported, albeit the Cabinet Secretary, in referring to the power of the database in Section 8, showed a marked lack of enthusiasm in his contribution on the 22nd of April 2010. But the report puts things in a different place. The intention that there was in 2010 is clearly as important today as it was then. Its implementation has been hobbled by our not seeing bits of it picked up. The report details in painful detail that lacuna exists. It proffers no real insight into why so little action flowed from Ms Graham and others' 3 years of hard work to get the bill over the finishing line and onto the statute book. The Cabinet Secretary in the debate specifically said we have an enabling power, talking about Section 8, but are not persuaded that a database is either needed nor wanted, nor is the committee. But things move on, and I think despite that being the view in 2010, we must now regard that as unfinished business in relation to what we're talking about today. The 8 years since royal assent in March 2011 are perhaps too long. Now, my experience of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, otherwise the DPLR, which I served on for 1,283 days until March 2016, illustrate perhaps some of the ways we might better implement Parliament's acts. It was a regular feature of the DPLR that we were saying to the government in relation to secondary legislation that there were errors in it. There might be small errors, there might be rather bigger errors. Frequently, what the government would say is that they would remedy the defects in the secondary legislation at the earliest opportunity. But in the real world, you saw that the earliest opportunity often proved to be elusively distant or even non-existent. So the committee agreed with my suggestion that we should record such commitments and publish our list of their commitments on a regular basis. If I recall correctly, it was quarterly. And that shone a light into a dusty corner of the legislative process. And you know what? Suddenly, these amendments that were promised started to happen because the committee was publishing the list of those that were outstanding, and it was in the government's interest to see the list shrink rather than continuing to grow. And perhaps in relation to legislation, it might be useful if we had a list of all the bits of legislation that have not yet been commenced. In this bill, it's all been commenced. In the 2009 Climate Change Act I was responsible for, there is a section that has not been commenced. Now, there is a good and proper reason why that's so, but nonetheless, it's not in the public domain until I discovered this morning that that had not been commenced. So I think if we were to do that, we might see that there'd be less likely that these important bits of legislation that we put forward don't simply disappear. Now, the bill we're talking about hasn't been forgotten. It's actually been amended in 3 places, twice by the Courts Reform Scotland Act in 2014 and by the Police and Fire Reform Act of 2012. So it hasn't been forgotten about, it's just it hasn't been fully implemented. Now, like others, I have been engaged by dogs when I'd rather they hadn't. I've indeed been sitting on 4 fang marks from a leafleting escapade throughout this debate. I can't exhibit them to you for rather obvious reasons. In the Falkirk West by-election in 2000, I shoved a leaflet through a door in Falkirk, and a dog collected the leaflet and my hand as part of the process. The scar is here, 6 stitches. Mr. and Mrs. Reid, who were the householders, kindly let me wash the wound. It turned out that the dog was called Oliver, so I'm the only politician to have a scar from being bitten by Oliver Reid. Now, the issue about out-of-control dogs or out-of-control humans. In the United States, dog fighting is a big issue, and they've routinely been destroying hundreds of dogs involved in that. But there's now people take these dog-fighting dogs, rehabilitate them, in most cases successfully, and put them into homes where they have happy lives. If that doesn't prove that the problem is the owners and not the dogs, I don't know what does. Presiding Officer.